Certaines histoires donnent du pouvoir lorsqu'elles sont racontées. Stories can heal. Remonter le temps lorsque Avec était mon parent. Avec is my kin. In this third episode, I speak with Cree playwright and theater director Floyd Favel from Poundmaker, Saskatchewan. This is a conversation on the medicine of stories and the reciprocity in the relationship between animals and humans.
When we speak of Indigenous theater, it goes beyond style, method, form, I say. It goes into unconscious, but unconscious is a Carl Jungian term. It's a Western European term. Mm-hmm. What we say is spirit world. Spirits in Cree atayokan means a spirit, and within our tradition, any animal, any being can enter your ceremony, and they will use the voice of I guess in English you call shaman. They use his voice, his vocal cords, and then they will speak through him or her. And I've seen those when I was young, and they're still around, those type of ceremonies, and there is people who can do that. But in my case, the beaver, he told me the story that I wrote. He spoke through me, and I wrote it down. So, and very often, sometimes as Indigenous artists, we exaggerate or mythologize an experience, and just to create a fiction, because theater is a fiction. And sometimes in our own life, we create a fiction. But in this case, there is no fiction. And it was very often I think of playwrights, other Indigenous playwrights, and I admire them, how they're able to write so many plays. Some of them just sit down and write a play and go to a dramaturg and get it worked on. But any play I wrote always came in a rhythm, in a burst of energy, in 1 or 2 days or 4 days. In this case, it was 4 days of this when I wrote about this beaver. And,
like a ceremony.
Yeah, it took, and I was visiting. Well, it was shortly after my mom died. My mother died a few months, and so I had gone to Washington, D.C. and New York on a project, and but I had felt it coming on, the story, something coming on, but I didn't know what, and I would often, middle of the day, I would, no matter where I was, if I was in a park or a restaurant, I would almost fall asleep, and I would need to be in quiet for a couple hours, and so finally I left and I went to visit a friend in Vermont, and in Vermont I arrived. I said hello, and I went to my room in the attic, and I basically stayed there for 4 or 5 days. I would come down once in a while, and there'd be a plate of food for me, and I would eat it, and then I would make some coffee, and I would go back up. It was in that time I would hear a rhythm, in my, in my mind or in my spirit, and the first thing I heard was Nusse Mustatan. That was the first thing I heard, which was, hey, grandson, I'm going to tell you something. And then I would listen, And he say, "Begamina." Once upon a time, "Begamina." He said, "Egi tegaga belsian maka wapmin mui ski denki spinegi tegaga belian." And that was the first thing they said was, I was good looking once, but to look at me, you would not think I had been good looking. And so I started thought, oh, that sounds like so I started to write. And then I would add, create, and then when I would get lost, I would hear a voice again, carrying me forward. So that voice, that rhythm, those sentences in Cree, almost like little threads of sentences, like would carry me along into the next step of the story. So it was half me and half this voice. And then if you look at, but at that time I was more young and not so knowledgeable. But nowadays, from what I've heard from spiritual leaders, elders, they always say, when you work with a spiritual dimension, half of it is you, and the other half is the other side. You have to do half the work. And so at that time, I found that to be true because I was reading, I wasn't passively listening and passively writing like an automatic writing. I was working with it, reaching it, working for it. Sometimes I'd feel I'd lost it, and then I would kind of backtrack in the story, and then I would find the right place again, and I would keep going, and then I'd hear another voice, another like progression. So it was I guess. If somebody had been to teach me Indigenous theater, nobody ever taught me that. But I had heard it by listening to old people talking and telling stories about animals. That was my study, you could say. And then it came time that something dramatic happened in my life, like the death of my mother. And then from there, it emerged that then the spirit being could tell me a story, I guess to heal me and to help me. Because the story I eventually wrote was this, the beaver and the death of all his relatives, and his grief and his mourning. So in a way, what white people call metaphor or analogy, that's what it was. But with indigenous people, we don't say that. We say, Tayuke, he told a sacred story. And in that sacred story, he healed you. So that was, it was beyond metaphor, beyond analogy, and beyond simile. And it simply became a healing story, but within the realm of theater. Because it was told to me in a series of voices, like a dramatic monologue. And so it went beyond theater, almost into like a super theater or a para theater. A para theater that went on the fringes of theater and the fringes of, I guess, the borders of cultural theory, the borders of storytelling, and it goes deep into the unconscious, and that's where you're roaming in that field, you're roaming in that dialogue, and you're in a very fragile state. So because you're dealing with an actual death, an actual grief, it's affecting your energy, your body, and then voila, you hear a story. And that was that story, and that's what it became to me, and that's what that story was. And to this day, I always remember it. And if I was to say, if somebody was to ask me, Floyd, tell me your process of being a playwright, I would say, I'm not a playwright. I'm not a dramatist. I would say I probably sincerely only wrote one drama, and that was Master of the Dew. Mm-hmm. That was a true process. That was the one process we always seek, that I sought in my theater training in Europe and in different places around the world.
You're saying that you were hearing a voice at first. When did you figure out it was the voice of the beaver?
Through the story, yeah. Through the story that the being was telling me. Of one time, he was that he had been good looking. He had been swimming along the creeks, living in his lodge, and in his lodge, the roof of his lodge was the sky. Just like us, we have a sky, and but what we see when we see a beaver is we see a lodge, and we just think it's a bunch of mud and dirt. But for them, it's a sky, just like we have a sky. Mm-hmm. And then the walls, we just think it's mud and dirt, but for them, it's a horizon too. And then they have a little mound of earth in there. We think it's just a pile of mud, but for them, it's our earth. And then within there, it's kind of like a micro world, macro world, and so that's what the beaver was telling me. That's how their world was, and so he said he was a beaver, so I could only assume he was a beaver. So,
and what did he teach you? What did you learn from him? From that experience?
I guess its greatest teaching for me was transform your experiences into art, into something that can be shared. You know, when we start to think of indigenous people and their relationship, I guess their connection to nature. Mm-hmm. We talk about connection to nature. Well, that's that. That's working with them, paying them. So it's like reciprocal. You must always work with them, give back what they give you. And all spiritual beings, all animals, they voluntarily give their lives to us, to sustain us. That's their pact. That's what they told the Great Spirit. They voluntarily did that. So then once we start looking at them as a commodity, then yeah, I think we have broken a spiritual law. The only thing you can go on is your dreams. Those are like your thread, Ariadne's thread, and so you must follow that. And they're not formulas. They're not A to B to C. It's not like school. They're very different from a Western education. And because this indigenous education that follows dreams, it's a total education. You must be immersed in it, and then you must live it minute by minute. And one of the main factors in dreams and spiritual knowledge is they say you're always being watched, even by animals, like a beaver from a creek.
Cet enregistrement a été réalisé sur le territoire traditionnel et non cédé du peuple algonquin Anishinaabe. Nous reconnaissons que les Anishinaabeg sont les gardiens et les défenseurs traditionnels de ces terres, tout comme de la Kichisibi, la rivière des Outaouais, et ce pour les générations à venir.